A tumultuous childhood in the American suburbs. Sarah's earliest memories were shaped by the wide, sun-soaked streets of suburban Texas, a world of picket fences and sprawling backyards where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over mowed lawns. But for Sarah, home was a fortress of cold stares and whispered conversations she was never meant to overhear. Her father, once so full of laughter in old photographs, became a shadow after her mother left. His eyes were rarely on her, always darting elsewhere, as if Sarah were an unwelcome guest instead of a daughter. Life with her stepmother was measured in the creak of the staircase, late at night, in rules that seemed tailored just for her. Sarah was blamed for muddy shoes at the door, for the spilled milk that nobody saw her touch, for every little storm inside that quiet house. The expectations were unspoken, but always heavy. Silence during dinner, beds made with military precision, report cards pinned to the fridge. More a list of her failures than her successes. At school, Sarah wasn't like the other kids. Most afternoons, she ate lunch alone at the far end of the cafeteria, pretending to read as whispers floated her way. Stories about a problem child whose mother ran away. Teachers, exhausted and overworked, believed what they heard from home, that Sarah was stubborn, slow to learn, quick to anger. She became known for what she lacked, not for what she tried to give. What hurt most weren't the punishments or the words said out loud, but the things left unsaid. Birthday parties she wasn't invited to, school plays where her father never showed, comments from neighbors, women with perfect hair and bright lipstick, shared over white plastic fences as they watched her ride her bike alone. She learned the art of being invisible, of shrinking herself into corners and fading into the background whenever suspicion or blame wandered her way. Despite everything, Sarah nursed a quiet hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of love. On rare nights, when the Texas wind howled and rattled the window panes, she dreamt of her mother's embrace and the sound of laughter that once filled the house, clinging to those memories the way a child clings to a comfort blanket. But dawn always broke, and with it came another day in a world that never seemed to make space for a girl like her. A deep wound in her heart. Beneath the outward silence and measured movements, Sarah's wounds ran deep, hidden by a carefully constructed mask she wore every day. She longed for kindness from her father, or at least for his eyes to soften, to land on her with the warmth she saw him give others. But after her mother's departure, the home became a cold battlefield, and Sarah was caught between the lines. She craved love, but found herself labeled as difficult, a burden whispered about behind closed doors. Her stepmother's accusations became law in the household. If something was broken, it must be Sarah. If there was a mess, she had made it. These constant, quiet condemnations chipped away at her sense of self. Soon enough, Sarah stopped defending herself. Too tired to protest, too afraid of making things worse. What hurt most wasn't being alone. It was feeling unworthy of being noticed at all. She watched other families at church and in the neighborhood, mothers brushing hair from their daughters' faces, fathers kneeling down to tie shoelaces or cheer from the sidelines at Little League games. In Sarah's house, praise was as scarce as sunlight on a cloudy day. Even when she got good marks, the acknowledgement was fleeting, lost in the wake of a new complaint. Isolation became her closest companion. She learned to keep secrets, like the letters she wrote, hidden in the lining of her old backpack, addressed to her real mom in California. She wrote about her dreams, her fears, her longing for a home where laughter didn't sound foreign, The battered mailboxes lining their street were witnesses to her hopes, even if most of those letters remained unsent, tucked away, out of reach. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah replayed every harsh word, every burst of anger, wondering if she truly was the girl everyone said she was. Doubt nodded her quietly, making her question if life could ever be different. The world outside seemed to get smaller and smaller, the walls of her reality closing in. Yet, even as old wounds threatened to define her, Sarah clung to the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe her mother missed her. Maybe kindness would find a way. Perhaps, if she wished hard enough or worked hard enough, something would change. This hope was fragile, but each day she kept it alive. An invisible life raft, keeping her afloat in the deep, dark waters of her childhood pain. The determination to rise and become independent. By the time Sarah turned 18, a quiet resolve had solidified inside her, a sense of weary survival that had grown year after year in the shadows of that suburban Texas house. For as long as she could remember, Sarah's world had been shaped by absence and accusation. But as high school neared its end, and the prospect of adulthood shimmered on the horizon, she realized she could choose a different path. She didn't have to stay, didn't have to keep carrying the weight of a fractured family that had never felt like home. On the night before graduation, Sarah packed a borrowed duffel bag with her few possessions, an old, dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, 3 faded Polaroids of her and her mother, and a battered notebook full of secrets in unsent letters. She left behind a letter for her father, short, letter-perfect handwriting that simply read, "I hope one day you see me, Sarah." Then, with little more than hope and the crisp bills from 2 years of part-time jobs, she boarded the first bus to New York City, her heart pounding in her chest like a starter's pistol, echoing across an empty track. New York introduced her to anonymity, but also to opportunity. The city was a jumbled symphony of taxi horns, street vendors, subway announcements, and 1,000 languages colliding in the air. For the first time, nobody knew her as that girl with the broken family. She could walk among the swirling crowds and choose her own story. But freedom, she quickly learned, was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her first weeks in New York were a blizzard of uncertainty. She rented a single room in a Queens apartment, her window looking out onto a graffiti-scrawled alley, in the distant, glittering promise of Manhattan's skyline. The rent was nearly all her savings, and Sarah found herself working every job she could manage, pouring coffee at a 24-hour diner, folding shirts at a downtown clothing store, babysitting squalling toddlers for tired, grateful mothers. She often survived on bagels or cup noodles, jotting her dreams on scraps of paper during subway rides between shifts. But even the city's harshest days felt easier than the cold, watchful silence of her father's house. Every challenge was her own to face, every small victory hers to savor. She learned to budget every penny, to stand her ground when customers snapped, and to navigate the city's unruly public transit with the steely determination of someone who refused to get lost. Sarah's academic life was another battlefield. She'd earned a modest scholarship and scraped together enough grants to enroll at a local community college, planning out each semester with military precision. Classes were scheduled around her jobs: morning lectures in constitutional law, hurried afternoons stocking boxes in a warehouse, evening classes in American literature. She never missed a class, her notebooks full of meticulous outlines and color-coded highlights. Her professors soon noticed her relentless drive. not the product of natural genius, but of pure, gritted teeth effort. Still, loneliness lingered at the edges. On holidays, she worked double shifts rather than sit alone in her dorm. When other students went home to decorated Christmas trees or Thanksgiving dinners, Sarah found solace in the city's libraries, surrounded by strangers, her mind lost in the pages of case law and classic novels. Some days, she missed her mother so fiercely it hurt to breathe. She allowed herself to write one letter each month, careful cursive filling the pages, but never an address. She had no idea if her words would ever find their way to California. What Sarah did have was a kind of discipline that no one, least of all her father, would have recognized. Early mornings became her sanctuary. She rose with the sun, running Central Park's icy paths alongside suited businessmen and dog walkers, lungs burning with each stride. The rhythm steadied her nerves and built the self-control she'd later call on in the courtroom. When things felt impossible, Sarah recalled fragments of childhood hope, a stubborn ember, never quite extinguished by disappointment.
Good morning.
She saw how far she'd come, from a shadow in her own home to a woman carving her place out of the chaos of New York. Even as failure stung, an eviction notice, a grade hovering too close to the line, offers rescinded for lack of connections, Sarah pressed forward, propelled by something deeper than anger, an unspoken promise to herself that she would become someone new. The turning point came in her second year, when a professor, Dr. Margaret Freeman, noticed her persistence. Dr. Freeman was a sharp-tongued veteran of the legal world and, unlike many, looked at Sarah not with pity, but with expectation. She pulled Sarah aside after class, handed her a flyer for a summer internship at the prestigious law firm of Blackwell and Holden, and said, "You want to be good? Take every hard job you can get. Show up when others quit." Sarah did just that. She applied for the internship, even though she doubted they'd pick a girl from Queens, broke and inexperienced. But it was her essay, raw and unvarnished, about justice and the yearning for fairness, that caught the partner's attention. Weeks later, to her disbelief, the firm called and offered her the spot. The summer at Blackwell and Holden changed everything. Sarah started out sorting mail and making copies, but she watched every negotiation, studied every motion and brief, and offered to stay late, learning to master the trade's intricacies. Her mentors were gruff, but impressed by her hunger to learn. She'd found her place not in the family she was born into, but in the structure and logic of law, in the idea that, somewhere, the world could be made fair, one case at a time. After that summer, Sarah transferred to a university with a partial scholarship, then stormed up the ranks through sheer will and sacrifice. She networked at every legal mixer and volunteered for pro bono cases, never turning down an opportunity to prove herself. Her weekends were lectures, her nights outlining for the LSAT, her calendar a grid of deadlines and reminders. Sarah's friendship circle formed slowly but solidly. Other outsiders, strivers with secrets and old wounds. Most never learned her full story, but that was all right. She built her life on trust earned, not freely given. By the time she graduated near the top of her class, her stepmother's voice in her mind had all but faded. Her father's absence became merely a vacant seat at a table she'd built for herself. Independence, Sarah realized, wasn't just about money or degrees. For her, it was a daily act of courage, a refusal to let the pain of the past define what came next. She learned to forgive herself for being difficult, to value her resilience more than anyone else's praise. New York became her home, not because it was easy, but because there, She belonged to herself. With her law degree in hand and a fledgling network cheering her on, Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, the city's neon glow stretching behind her. The scars of her childhood remained, but now they were simply part of her story, not the end of it. She had forged her own family of friends, colleagues, and clients, and was finally, fiercely free. Success in the cold return. A decade had passed since Sarah left Texas behind. The memory of suburban sun and silent dinners overshadowed by the dazzling, relentless energy of Manhattan. In those 10 years, she had built a life that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Every morning, Sarah's days began before dawn, with a run along the East River. Fog clung to skyscraper spires, and the city's sirens, always present, were but a distant hum, background noise to her focus. She liked those quiet moments. The world felt orderly, manageable, as she prepared for the rapid-fire chaos each day would bring. At just 28, Sarah was a rising star of New York's legal circles. She'd founded her own boutique law firm, specializing in corporate litigation and family law. Fields she knew, both professionally and painfully, inside and out. Her office sat atop a midtown high-rise, floor-to-ceiling windows, laying Manhattan at her feet. Mahogany shelves lined her walls, filled with casebooks, and, in a small corner, 3 weathered Polaroids that hadn't left her side since the night she boarded that bus out of Texas. She kept them hidden behind a thick volume of constitutional commentary. Sarah's reputation was one of cool precision. She was unwavering in negotiations, sharp in the courtroom, and famed for her refusal to be outworked. Nothing in her life was left to chance. Her assistants admired her discipline. Her clients depended on her composure, and her adversaries respected, even feared, her clarity of purpose. She was, friends joked, the storm in a suit. But with success came distance, both chosen and imposed. Sarah maintained a cordial, professional facade, but rarely let anyone close. Dinners with colleagues never slid into personal conversation. Invitations to happy hours or birthday parties were turned down with a polite smile. She invested her energy into her cases and her causes instead. Pro bono work for women fleeing abusive households, scholarships for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds, midnight hours pored over legal reforms that might one day make someone else's world a little fairer. News of her success traveled faster than she could have anticipated. Old high school acquaintances reached out through social media, eager to reconnect. Her name appeared in legal magazines and city business journals. Interviews described her as the tenacious Texan reshaping family law. But no matter how many accolades or headlines she earned, Sarah never once heard from her father or stepmother. They remained fixtures of a past she'd spent a decade outrunning, a wound she'd forced herself not to touch. That calculated, distance shattered on a rainy afternoon in late spring. Sarah was reviewing a deposition transcript when her office manager interrupted. Somebody named Carol Evans was on the line. The manager said quietly, insisting it was an emergency. For a moment, Sarah's breath caught. Her mother's name, spoken aloud in this polished space, felt unreal, like the echo of a dream she'd long ago tried to forget. The call itself was brief, stilted, hesitant, painful in its rawness. Carol was in trouble. After years away, she'd returned to Texas and was now embroiled in a bitter dispute over her late grandmother's estate. Sarah's father and stepmother, Carol explained, were contesting the will, trying to cut her out completely. Carol's voice trembled when she asked for help, but she never once said she wanted forgiveness, only protection. Fairness. For hours after, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring out at the unyielding city skyline. She remembered the weight of unspoken accusations, the silence across the dinner table, the feeling of being unseen in her own home. All those years, striving for control and justice, and now the past was demanding her attention, calling her back not with regret, but with an urgent need for action. Returning to Texas was more surreal than she imagined. The sky stretched wider than it had in her memory, the air heavy with humidity and nostalgia. Sarah rented a sleek, black sedan and drove past her old school, the playground where whispers had followed her, the church whose stained glass windows once watched her pray for some sense of belonging. Nothing looked smaller, only more distant, as if she'd crossed an invisible barrier between lives. The reunion with her father and stepmother was as cold as the marble floors of their remodeled suburban house. They barely recognized her at first, expecting the quiet, uncertain girl they'd known, not the poised attorney standing in their doorway with a briefcase and a set jaw. Her presence unsettled them. Her questions cut sharper than they'd expected. Sarah noticed the way her father glanced away, unable to meet her gaze. Every conversation was a chess match. Her father's tone was defensive, peppered with justifications and fractured memories. Her stepmother, icy as ever, dismissed Carol's claims and spun stories of sacrifice and misunderstanding. But Sarah was no longer a child, desperate for approval. She listened, stone-faced, gathering evidence, parsing for inconsistencies, letting her legal training do what years of wishing never could, hold them accountable. In the courthouse, Sarah wielded the law with a clarity that was almost unforgiving. She filed motions, cited precedents, exposed the tangled web of property and inheritance her parents had tried to weave. Witnesses were summoned, old family friends, former neighbors, some siding with her father, others with a reluctant truth. Sarah's own testimony was measured, professional. She recalled childhood events only as facts, never letting emotion spill into her voice. Inside, however, her heart pounded with old pain, that familiar ache of wanting to be heard, to be believed. Outside the courtroom, there was no reconciliation. Sarah stayed in a hotel downtown, ordering room service, reviewing case files late into the night while the Texas wind rattled the window. She met with her mother in quiet diners, both of them more comfortable discussing legal filings than memories. It was awkward, stilted, but for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of power. She was no longer powerless, no longer that frightened girl hiding away her letters. When the verdict was read, the law sided with Carol. Sarah's work had exposed the unfair dealings and ensured her mother would receive her rightful share of the estate. The victory was not celebrated with champagne or tears. Instead, Sarah shook her mother's hand, both of them understanding that justice, not reconciliation, was all they could offer each other for now. Once business was concluded, Sarah drove back to her childhood house one last time. She didn't go inside. Instead, she sat in her car, watching the porch light flicker in the dusk, and allowed herself to feel both the ache and the relief of closure. The house looked ordinary, even small, no longer a place of threat or longing. Returning to Manhattan felt like waking from a vivid, unsettling dream. She slipped back into her routine. The early runs, the court appearances, the silent office with the hidden photographs. But something had shifted inside her. She was no longer running from her past, nor letting it dictate the rhythms of her present. Cold, perhaps, but also clear-eyed, Sarah understood that true independence was not the absence of pain, but the courage to face it, confront it, and choose one's future all the same. In the months that followed, Sarah's work took on a deeper tint of empathy. She argued custody cases with more compassion. She listened more closely to clients trying to escape their own silent wars. Success was no longer just about power or acclaim. It was about using what she had built to make justice real for others, ones who, like her, had once been overlooked. And if her voice was sometimes colder, sometimes sharper, it was only because she never wanted anyone in her care to feel powerless again. The fateful reunion. The Manhattan morning was colder than usual, a drizzle tracing silver lines down Sarah's window as she sifted through the day's case files. It was midway through April, but an early chill still clung to the city, matching the undercurrent of tension she'd felt all week. Amid her routine, a message blinked across her phone. Her assistant's voice, urgent. "Sarah, there's a call from Texas. She says she's your mother." For a few moments, all the noise of the city faded. Sarah's hands hovered over her laptop, heart pounding, as the past she'd carefully folded away pressed into her present. She answered, bracing herself not for comfort, but something raw. On the other end, Carol Evans's voice was tentative, aged by time and regret. "Sarah, honey, I'm sorry to break into your life like this, but I need your help." The halting explanation came in pieces: an inheritance dispute, her father and stepmother's legal maneuverings, her mother's sense of injustice building to desperation. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need someone to stand up for me," Carol whispered, her voice trembling with both hope and shame. Sarah listened without interruption. She took notes, her legal mind parsing the facts, even as her chest thudded with old, familiar ache. When the call ended, she sat in stillness for a long time. The city, her city, buzzed below her window. But inside her office, memory and duty collided in silence. She had outgrown so much, built herself steel strong. But this call had cracked open something tender and unresolved. She booked a flight that evening, her travel bag packed with court documents and, almost out of old habit, those faded Polaroids from childhood. When she landed in Houston, humid air clung to her skin, heavy with nostalgia and dread.
That's him.
Renting a car, Sarah navigated miles of highways, their billboards and stretches of magnolia trees, at once familiar and foreign. Her first stop was a diner off a 2-lane road, a tentative meeting set by her mother. Sarah arrived before dawn, heart hammering as she watched the blue and red neon flicker. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon was comforting, but the atmosphere was tense, filled with anticipation. Carol Evans was already seated at the corner booth, stirring sugar nervously into a chipped mug. She looked smaller than Sarah remembered, a little stooped, her hair threaded with gray. For a moment, neither spoke, just regarding each other across Formica and years lost. Finally, Carol managed a tremulous smile. "You look just like your father did at your age," she said softly. Sarah took the seat opposite. The silence stretched, faces etched by years of separation and pain. "I got your call," Sarah said at last. "Tell me everything. Don't hold back." The next hour unfolded in low, hushed voices as Carol sketched the outlines of the inheritance dispute. How Sarah's father and stepmother had wielded influence over the family estate following the grandmother's death, twisting legal procedures to edge Carol out. "I never thought I'd come back here, let alone call you," Carol confessed, tears brimming. "But they're ruthless, Sarah. I didn't know where else to turn." Sarah's own hurt mingled with a surge of protectiveness. "You did the right thing. she murmured, voice
Yes, this
even and professional, despite the storm within. No one's going to push you around. Not while I'm here. That afternoon, Sarah drove to her childhood neighborhood, windshield wipers thudding in the Texas rain. The streets seemed both unchanged and infinitely distant from the girl she had once been. She parked outside the house where she'd grown up, its familiar blue shutters now faded and cracked. Through the lace curtains, the figures of her father and stepmother materialized, ghosts made flesh after so many years apart. She rang the doorbell, heart lodged in her throat. The door opened to her father's wary eyes, and behind him, her stepmother's disapproving glare. For a moment, all three stood, suspended in a silence thick as cotton. Her father's face was older, cheeks etched deeply, but it still bore the lines of the man who never once said he was proud of her. "Sarah," he said at last, voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you again. What brings you here?" The veneer of politeness was quickly scraped away by tension. Sarah stepped inside, her every movement deliberate, a far cry from the uncertain teenager they remembered. "I'm here on legal business," she said coolly,
For now.
setting her briefcase down. "Your actions against my mother are not going to stand. I'm her counsel now." The living room, once the scene of her childhood isolation, became a courtroom of sorts. Her stepmother scoffed. "So you come back as the big-shot lawyer to paint us as villains?" The words stung, but Sarah's focus was unwavering. "I came because you're trying to steal what's not yours," she replied, quietly but firmly. "And I won't let you." She laid out the facts matter-of-factly. Property deeds, forged signatures, coercion. Her father shifted defensively, anger flashing in his eyes. "We gave your mother more than she deserved, Sarah. She abandoned you, left you behind. Don't forget who stayed." Sarah's hands trembled, though she kept her voice measured. "Staying means nothing if it comes without love or decency. I'm not here to talk about old wounds. I'm here to make sure justice is done." Waves of old emotions rose, sharp and hot. Grief, anger, a longing for recognition. But years of advocacy had trained her for just this: speaking truth, standing tall, refusing to be cowed by history. Her stepmother moved to argue, but Sarah, for the first time, silenced her with nothing but the weight of her authority. Afterwards, Sarah met her mother at a nearby motel to review legal documents. In the quiet of lamplight, Carol tried to apologize for her absence, her regret pouring out in trembling sentences. Sarah listened, but found the hurt was too old to untangle so quickly. "Let's just focus on the case," she said softly, not unkind. Late that night, rain drumming on the motel roof, Sarah stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the realization that victory in court couldn't return what was lost. But, for her mother's sake and her own, she would see this through to the end. The days that followed saw tense depositions, terse exchanges, and more than one emotionally charged hearing. Sarah fought relentlessly, her presence in the courtroom crisp and imposing. Her father and stepmother could barely meet her eyes. More than once, she caught passing looks, fear, maybe, but also belated respect. The fight was exhausting, but clarity came in small victories. A judge's nod, Carol's fragile smile, the knowledge that, at last, Sarah was on the side of the powerless, not the powerless herself. The fateful reunion was not a fairy tale closure, nor a warm embrace and forgiveness. But for the first time, Sarah understood that she was no longer defined by rejection or longing. This return was not about healing the past, but building something new: dignity, protection, and the right to choose her place in the world. Fighting for justice through the law, Sarah had faced many battles in her ascent, from the silent corners of her childhood home to the high-rise courts of Manhattan. Yet, returning to Texas for this case, she found herself thrust into the most personal and grueling fight of her career, not out of ambition or duty, but a deep-rooted resolve to right a lifetime's worth of wrongs. This was not just about an inheritance or a contested will. It was about finally demanding fairness where there had been none, about giving her mother and herself a voice after years spent in silence. From the outset, Sarah knew the courtroom would be hostile terrain. The local legal community was tight-knit, the courthouse itself a relic of small-town pride, filled with wood-paneled walls, portraits of stern-faced judges, and the faint smell of old books and polished floors. Sarah's very presence was met with suspicion by the opposing counsel, her father's lawyer, an old friend with plenty of sway in the county. Her family's attorney painted Carol as a gold digger, an outsider, a woman who had abandoned her child and forfeited her rights. Sarah countered with poise and precision. She pored over legal documents late into the night, deciphering decades-old deeds and trust funds, identifying the subtle edits in forged signatures that pointed to manipulation. She built her argument step by step, starting with the most basic premise: the law, like love, should not be manipulated to exclude, diminish, or silence the vulnerable. In pretrial depositions, Sarah maintained a professional calm, even as tempers flared. She questioned her father about the timeline of events, each answer revealing evasions or carefully revised memories. Her stepmother, stone-faced and unyielding, insisted on her version of the truth, spinning stories of sacrifice and steadiness. But Sarah had learned, after years of wading through ambiguity, how to spot the cracks in rehearsed testimony. She knew when a hand trembled ever so slightly, when a glance flickered with guilt, when silence spoke louder than vowed innocence. The first hearing began on a damp Monday morning. Carol sat beside Sarah at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly. Together, her nervous breaths audible as the judge entered. Sarah made her opening remarks with controlled intensity. She did not dwell on familial pain. Instead, she let the evidence speak. Property appraisals, letters from the grandmother, financial logs that contradicted her father's claims. In clear, unwavering language, she set the stage. This was a struggle for basic fairness. The days stretched into weeks, each one a test of endurance. Sarah summoned neighbors, former accountants, even an old friend of her grandmother, who remembered promises made years before. Some supported Carol's account, speaking of estrangement engineered by Sarah's father and stepmother, patterns of control isolated from prying eyes. Others defended the status quo, unwilling to cross the powerful family at the center of the community. With each piece of testimony, each cross-examination, each document admitted into evidence, Sarah chipped away at the veneer her father and stepmother had so carefully constructed. Outside the courtroom, tensions ran high. Sarah avoided her childhood neighborhood, refusing to be lured by nostalgia or haunted by echoes of isolation. The hotel became her refuge. Evenings spent reviewing briefs under harsh lamplight. Phone calls home to New York for advice or reassurance. Occasional walks along the river to clear her mind. Sometimes she watched her mother sleep, back curled in exhaustion after hours of questions and accusations, and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it surprised her. Yet, the fight was taking its toll. The longer the case stretched, the heavier the emotional weight became. Sarah's father refused any direct conversation, avoiding her gaze in hallways and on the stand. Once, in a moment between hearings, he brushed by her and muttered, "I never thought you'd turn on your own family." The accusation stung, but Sarah stood her ground. "Family means nothing if it's built on lies," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. Despite her steel, the anxiety gnawed at Sarah. She worried about her ability to stay objective, to shield Carol from the most vicious barbs, to not let old hurts cloud her reasoning. More than once, she cried quietly in the bathroom stall at the courthouse, wiping her face clean before returning to her role as advocate and protector. But if her voice shook, it was only with conviction. If her hands trembled, it was with urgency to finally set things right. As the trial reached its climax, Sarah delivered her closing argument to a packed courtroom. Her words were measured yet passionate. "Your Honor," she concluded, "this case is not only about property. It is about fairness, about the right for every person to be heard and respected, especially within one's own family. Justice must be blind, not just to reputation, but to the loneliness that comes when family fails to protect its own. My client seeks not vengeance, but dignity, a chance to reclaim what should have always been hers." The verdict did not come swiftly. Days of deliberation left Sarah and Carol in limbo, each hour stirring doubts and reawakening old traumas. But when the decision finally arrived, it landed with the force of absolution. The court recognized the manipulations, the attempts to erase Carol's rightful place, and ruled in her favor. The disputed estate would be divided fairly. The ruling included a rebuke of the tactics used by Sarah's father and stepmother, affirming Carol's dignity after years of erasure. The media coverage was modest, but respectful. A few local headlines praised Sarah's legal brilliance, speaking of the Manhattan lawyer who brought the truth to light. But the real victory played out behind closed doors. For once, the powerless had prevailed, and Sarah had proven, to her mother, to herself, that cycles of injustice could be broken. After the case ended, Sarah stood with Carol outside the courthouse. The Texas sun, suddenly brilliant and unforgiving. They did not speak of forgiveness. There were wounds too deep for easy closure. But as Carol slipped her hand into Sarah's, there was a sense of quiet peace, a recognition that by fighting through the law, they had claimed a future neither thought possible. In that moment, for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the past finally start to lift, closing the past and starting anew. When the courtroom battle concluded, the silence that lingered between Sarah and her mother was not the silence of hurt, but of hard-fought relief. The verdict's echo had faded, leaving in its place a tentative freedom neither woman quite knew how to use. For Sarah, the victory was laced with paradox. She had proven herself, protected her mother, and looked her childhood demons straight in the eye, yet the old scars remained. This was not simple triumph. It was a reckoning, the slow and necessary act of turning the last page on an old, painful chapter. For a few days after the final ruling, Sarah stayed in Texas, rather than rush back to New York and her whirlwind of routines. She and her mother split their time between a modest hotel and long walks along the quiet banks of the river outside town, neither of them eager to return to the house that had kept so many secrets. Their conversations were gentle and awkward. Small talk about Carol's favorite movies, Sarah's work in New York, the weather. Apologies hovered unspoken, too raw to touch. But there was an undercurrent of mutual recognition, a cautious willingness to try for understanding, if not forgiveness. One afternoon, beneath the heavy shade of a pecan tree, Carol spoke what Sarah had been carrying in her heart. "I know I can't take back what I did. And I know you didn't come here for me. But I want you to know that I see you, really see you, for the woman you've become. I'll always regret the years I lost." Her voice was hoarse, vulnerable in a way Sarah had never heard before. Sarah nodded, feeling the tide of grief and gratitude well up at the same time. "I can't change what's done, Mom, but I don't have to let it decide who I am now. I've spent a long time living in the shadow of that house. I'm ready to step out of it." For once, there was nothing left to argue, no old hurt to relitigate. Sarah realized that closure didn't require reconciliation or erasure of what had happened. It called for an active acceptance, a deliberate setting down of burdens carried too long. After they parted, Sarah drove one last time past her childhood home. She parked at the curb, engine idling, and watched as the evening sun cast slanted shadows over the old blue shutters. Children from another family played in the yard, their laughter spilling out where there had once been only silence and suspicion. Sarah smiled softly, no longer feeling like a trespasser in her own memories. The next morning, she packed her suitcase, zipped up the compartment, holding the old Polaroids and handwritten letters, and boarded a plane back to Manhattan. As the landscape shifted from endless Texas flatlands to the patchwork quilt of the East Coast, Sarah felt a quiet exhilaration prickle beneath her skin. She had not run this time. She had returned, looked her past in the face, and refused to be defined by it. Now, more than ever, the future felt like something she could choose for herself. Back in New York, life unfolded as it always had. Case files cluttering her desk, emails demanding attention, early morning runs slicing through the city's pre-dawn haze. But everything felt different. The old pressure in her chest was gone, replaced by a steady sense of purpose. Her demeanor softened, her laugh more frequent during team meetings and after-work gatherings. Sarah began to accept invitations she once would have declined. A friend's birthday dinner in Brooklyn, a hiking trip upstate, evenings at book clubs, where she could get lost in novels for pleasure instead of escape. With her newfound clarity, Sarah launched a pro bono initiative within her firm, focused on helping women and children fighting for their own voices in legal battles. A shelter, a desperate parent, a teenager, not unlike the girl she used to be. Each case was both a challenge and a piece of healing. In advocating for her clients, she recognized the same determination that had driven her all those years ago. She no longer needed to prove anything to the world. Instead, she aimed to empower others, creating space for those with painful histories to build new beginnings. Letters to her mother became a quiet ritual. Some weeks, they shared stories, recipes, or favorite movies. Other weeks, their missives were just a few lines, simple check-ins, reminders that even from a distance, the door to connection remained ajar. The relationship would never be easy, but it was authentic, honest about what they could and could not be for each other. Sometimes Sarah attended family therapy sessions alone, learning to forgive herself and accept love without suspicion or armor. She also allowed herself to forge deeper connections elsewhere. Sarah rekindled old friendships, formed new ones with colleagues who admired her tenacity and wit. She tried dating, for the first time approaching relationships not as tests of self-worth, but as possibilities for mutual growth and companionship. The city, once merely a vessel for ambition, became a living tapestry of opportunity, comfort, and belonging. One Saturday, as Sarah crossed the Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise, She paused to take in the city's shimmering skyline, the bridges, the river, the endless currents of life. For the first time, she felt entirely unburdened. She had not forgotten
Here you go.
Texas, nor erased the wounds and disappointments, but she had made peace with their place in her story. The past could be part of her, but it would no longer steer the course of her life. Standing there in the orange wash of morning, Sarah whispered a promise to herself that she would shape her own destiny, love boldly, and never allow old pain to dictate future joy. That she would remain resilient, fiercely compassionate, ever open to hope, and become, every day, the architect of her own new beginnings. And as the sun rose fully over the city, Sarah stepped forward, no longer haunted, no longer running, but ready to live the life she had fought so hard to claim.